So I am absolutely thrilled to have the following conversation with Dr. Sarah Ballantyne as we will be chatting about nutrient density and Nutrivore. An award-winning public speaker, New York Times bestselling author, and world-renowned health expert. So Dr. Sarah Ballantyne, PhD, believes the key to improving public health is scientific literacy. She creates educational resources to help people improve their day-to-day diet and lifestyle choices, empowered and informed by the most current evidence-based scientific research. Dr. Sarah began her career as a science communicator and health educator when she launched her original website, thepaleomom.com, in 2011. And on this platform, Dr. Sarah combined her background in medical research with her experience using diet and lifestyle to mitigate a dozen diagnosed health conditions, to create a wealth of educational resources, and amass an audience of millions. And since then, Dr. Sarah has continued to follow the science, diving deep into immune health, metabolic health, gut microbiome health, nutritional sciences, and the compelling evidence for health at any size, while also observing the harm of healthism, diet culture, dogmatic misinformation, predatory marketing. And with Nutrivore, which of course we're going to chat a lot about here, Dr. Sarah seeks to create a positive and inclusive approach to dietary guidance based in science and devoid of dogma, using nutrient density and sufficiency as its basic principles. And thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Sarah. As if you couldn't tell, I am so excited to have this conversation with you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited too.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and if you could talk briefly about how you made a lot of my audience is familiar with your Paleo Mom website, which is just amazing. But now you're making the transition, and we have wonderful Nutrivore website as well. So can you talk about that transition?
Yeah, I think it's a transition that really began probably 6 or 7 years ago, and it really started with observing a problem in not just the paleo community, but sort of like the health and wellness community more broadly, where we continue to define diets based on the foods we avoid. Most of the diets that are popular right now, if I might venture so far as to say all of the diets that are popular right now, when you're learning about that diet, you have a list of restrictions. So things that you're going to cut out completely, right, or avoid, or things that you're going to have in very measured quantities. And most diets boil down to like a list of rules, right? The good foods and the bad foods. And the problem with this is, first of all, psychology studies show that dichotomous approaches to diet, where you have rules and you have yes foods and no foods, or good foods and bad foods, actually increases the risk of regaining lost weight and increases the chance of developing disordered eating patterns. But my observation in this community is that I think this is very human nature, right? I think what happens is we have some kind of reason why we go on a diet. I think it's very common for that reason to be weight loss. We go on a diet that's you avoid these 10 foods or 100 foods. And what happens is our bodies fight weight loss, right? Our bodies do not want to lose weight. So as we lose weight, our basal metabolic rate slows down and our hunger hormone ghrelin increases. And it becomes harder and harder to keep losing weight. And it becomes harder and harder to maintain that weight loss. And so when we define a diet based on, I cut out these things, I lost weight initially, I'm not losing weight anymore. Well, what's the next thing to do? I'm going to cut out more things. And then we repeat that cycle of an ever more restrictive eating pattern. And I think that, defining diets, I mean, this goes back to the 70s with low fat, right? Like defining diets based on the thing that you cut out creates a mindset where when we want more results, whatever that is, the natural next step is, well, I got these results by cutting stuff out. Well, now I'll just cut out more stuff to get that next step of results that I want. And what's happening in my observation, and certainly the scientific evidence would back this up, is that we're actually magnifying a problem that already exists, which is the rampant prevalence of nutrient deficiencies and insufficiencies. So our food supply is abundant in calories, doesn't actually contain that many foods that are really dense in vitamins and minerals and phytonutrients, right? Unless you're eating a very whole foods and very varied diet. So unless you're kind of in that sort of privileged space to be able to afford food like that, you have nutrient deficiencies. And when you get on this like diet train yo-yo, what ends up happening is the more things you learn through diet culture, the more restrictive your eating becomes, the more you're actually exaggerating nutrient deficiencies, which are driving your health problems, which are then driving that guilt blame cycle, and the yo-yo continues. And I, in observing this as a thought leader and a health educator and dare I say influencer, it's not my favorite word, I I've really been searching for the solution to this problem. And I've done a lot of communication around nutrient density since my very earliest days blogging in 2011, 2012. And that to me was like the missing piece of education that people don't have, which is very basically, what do nutrients do in the body and what foods contain them and how much do I need? And that's not integrated into most dietary approaches. I mean, it's obviously integrated into the autoimmune protocol because of my work, but that's what Nutrivore is, right? It's very much just understanding outside of any particular dietary structure, outside of labeling foods as good or bad, getting away from those dogmatic approaches to food. It's just about understanding what foods contain what nutrients, and how do we choose foods to make sure we're getting all of the nutrients that we need. And what I think is so powerful about Nutrivore is that you can apply Nutrivore principles to a diet that you resonate with. If you love the paleo diet, you can be Nutrivore paleo, but you can also apply it to no dietary structure in particular. You can apply it to anti-diet, intuitive eating. It's very compatible with the 10th principle of intuitive eating. And you could use it as your primary guiding principle for a diet. So it kind of lives in that world between diet culture and anti-diet, and pushing back against diet culture by providing this really simple and logical solution, which is like, let's just get all the nutrients that our bodies need from the foods we eat.
No, makes sense. And you kind of answered a question that I had while you were talking, because you mentioned like someone can follow a paleo diet but still incorporate Nutrivore. And I was thinking that some people might be thinking, because you talk a lot about, at least with Paleo Mom, the autoimmune protocol, as you mentioned, but same thing, like just because you follow autoimmune protocol doesn't mean it has to be a restrictive diet where you're not getting the necessary nutrients. You could still incorporate Nutrivore, and probably should incorporate Nutrivore concepts.
Yeah, I would argue that the autoimmune protocol was my test case for Nutrivore principles, because the AIP has had nutrient density as one of its 5 pillars. If you kind of thought of AIP as having 3 lifestyle pillars, right? Sleep, activity, and stress management, and then 2 diet pillars, which is the elimination and challenge, right? The phases of the AIP where you discover your own food triggers, and nutrient density. So that nutrient density is really synonymous with Nutrivore. It basically means we're choosing foods that have a lot of nutrients per calorie. Nutrivore actually provides a really amazing tool for AIPers by using the Nutrivore score, which is a nutrient profiling method that I developed as part of the foundational content for Nutrivore to help identify those really nutrient dense foods. So it actually gives like additional tools to people following the AIP to actually increase the nutrient density of their diets, which is really important for immune health.
Yeah, I absolutely love the Nutrivore score. And, just was fascinated. Like, for example, I'm pretty sure you mentioned that collard greens had a higher Nutrivore score than kale, for example, which, I had no
Yes.
idea. And, we'll talk about like Brazil nuts had the highest score for nuts. So with that being said, can you talk about some of the, foods, especially vegetables, what some of the highest scores?
Yeah, I actually like pulled some scores, and like I brought notes so that I had some like scores to share, because I think this is such a fun intellectual exercise. So taking a step backwards, the Nutrivore score is just a nutrient profiling method. But when I started to build Nutrivore, my first intention was to go through the science on nutrient profiling, find a nutrient density score that I liked and use that. And what happened after reading nothing but nutrient profiling papers for 3 months is I decided I didn't like any of them. Like none of them made sense. And one of the big things that's happening in nutrient profiling right now is this like effort to retrofit a nutrient density score to what's called the healthy eating index, which is a measurement of how well somebody follows USDA dietary guidelines. So they're trying to figure out what nutrients to include in the score so that a high score would match a high healthy eating index, which I think is completely backwards. I think we should be just doing the math, whatever makes the most sense to represent the food, and then using that to better understand diet. And so that's what I've done with the Nutrivore score. It's algorithmically very similar to the nutrient-rich foods index, but it uses 33 nutrients in the calculation. Basically, every nutrient that we have complete enough data that it's fair to include it. And very carefully making sure not to over weight plant food nutrients or animal food nutrients. So you really just get like total nutrients per calorie. And the insight that the Nutrivore score has given me into different foods has just been fascinating, because for me, it was like, let's do this math. Let's do the math on 8,000 foods. Then let's look at the numbers and see what they tell us. Like that's the scientific method, right? And it really shows, for example, just how important leafy vegetables are, how important the cruciferous vegetable family, the cabbage family are, how important mushrooms are. It really shows you why organ meat is so fantastic, but also like shellfish and fish are just crazy high as well. But some of the top, the number one top food in the entire database is canned clam liquid, which has a Nutrivore score of 14,744, which I would have never, ever guessed in a million years that the liquid you drain from canned clam or clam juice, right, would have the most nutrients per calorie. It just so happens you've got a lot of dissolved minerals and vitamins in that liquid. It has quite a lot of protein. It's like bone broth on steroids. I never would have guessed that. Watercress is one of the highest vegetables that most of us could find in a grocery store. There's lots of really obscure ones that are higher. It has a Nutrivore score of 6,989. Turnip greens have a Nutrivore score of 6,370. Swiss and rainbow chard are up in that range. So rainbow chard is 6,573 and Swiss chard is 6,198. Radishes are like a surprising super nutrient dense food. They have a Nutrivore score of 5,863. Garlic is 5,622. And then kale, which I feel like is like the pinnacle example of a superfood, is 4,233. Like all of these are crazy high. The lowest is zero. The lowest is zero. White sugar has a Nutrivore score of 1. So it just kind of shows you like this math really does bear out if you've got foods that are 0 and foods that are 14,000. But if you were to get 100% of everything like in your diet and only 100% on a 2,000 calorie a day diet, you would be looking at an average Nutrivore score of like 165. Right. So we typically say anything over 150-ish, because 2,000 calories is not a super accurate way to determine how many calories someone needs. Anything over 150-ish is going to give you more nutrients than energy. But the great thing about these super high score foods is the more of them you eat, the more room you are earning for quality of life foods to round out with foods that aren't nutritionally impressive, but still can be very valuable foods. Something like white rice has a Nutrivore score of 66, I believe. It's not nutritionally impressive, but it is a great source of resistant starch if you tolerate rice. And there are studies showing that people who eat more rice, especially men, have lower rates of cardiovascular disease, likely due to the impact on the gut microbiome, which is studies show is very favorable from white rice. So the more of these like kale and collard greens and mustard greens and turnip greens and seafood and organ meat that we eat, the more having something that has a low Nutrivore score is not actually going to impact the overall quality of our whole diet. And then we get to enjoy these foods to round out our meals.
So it sounds like diversity is still important, not just to
Yeah.
focus on the high Nutrivore scores. An example, I believe you said that during one of the videos I was watching, that strawberries is the number one fruit or berry when it comes to berries. Number one berry when it comes to Nutrivore score, followed by blackberries. A lot of people think blueberries would be the highest, and cranberries weren't too high. But it doesn't mean you can't have cranberries, you can't have blueberries, and you should just focus on the strawberries and the blackberries, correct?
Correct. So one of the main principles, and this is getting into like the challenges of scientific communication and attention spans in our modern age. But one of the things that I'm building out on the Nutrivore.com website is a better understanding of what I call nutritionally distinct food families. So instead of thinking of our 4 or 5 food groups, which are typically based on how a food is grown and or maybe one nutrient, right? So we've got protein foods and we've got fiber foods and we've got calcium foods. I mean, really, that's kind of how we think of food groups, at least in terms of USDA dietary guidelines and my plate. With Nutrivore, we're taking a broader look at what nutrients foods contain. And so there's a collection of food families that offer something very special. So seafood in general, some of our most nutrient dense animal foods and the long chain omega-3 fats are incredibly important. Plus they're very, very good sources of vitamins and minerals. So they're nutritionally distinct because of those long chain omega-3 fats. Vegetable families that are nutritionally distinct include cruciferous vegetables. They contain glucosinolates, which we can't get from other vegetables, which are very important phytonutrients that reduce cancer risk, it's most strongly, as well as cardiovascular disease risk. Alliums, the onion family, are a nutritionally distinct food because they have thiosulfonates, which again are very, very important for reducing cardiovascular disease risk and cancer risk, but also type 2 diabetes risk. Leafy vegetables, really, we're talking about fiber types that are particularly important for the gut microbiome and some of our most nutrient dense foods. Mushrooms have a lot of different things going on. So they have a few classes of really unique phytonutrients. They also have unique fiber types that we can't get anywhere else. And they contain an amino acid. It's not part of the 20 our bodies use to make proteins, but that has really important roles in our body. It's found in almost every tissue, called ergothioneine, which has this really like potent antioxidant effects that has actually been named the longevity vitamin in scientific studies because it's such a cool, not a vitamin at all, but amino acid. So mushrooms are really important. And then root vegetables, again, you're talking about a functionally distinct collection of fibers for the gut microbiome, resistant starch. So those are our most important families. From there, we would say avocados and olives would be like that little group would be really important as healthy fat sources. And fruit, we really see the biggest like benefits to our health from the berry family and citrus. And so each one of these has something nutritionally distinct to offer. The Nutrivore score can help us identify the most nutrient dense within each of these families. So it's really important to sort of understand we're not adapted to one food or one food group. We really need this full, at least this collection of foods in order to meet our nutritional needs, in order to get all of the different nutrients that our bodies need. And then we can use the Nutrivore score on top of identifying these really important food families to help like up the ante in terms of like how much nutritional benefit we're getting for every bite.
Yeah, you mentioned citrus, citrus and berries, but I also saw a video on bananas, and just raving about bananas, and I'll admit that that's one of the fruit that I usually tell people to stay away from, or at least not stay away from, but not to eat too much because of the sugar. So I'd like to get your thoughts on fruit and sugar, because maybe I shouldn't be advising people to avoid bananas on a regular basis, or maybe they should stick with small bananas.
I
I don't.
I should have come with a visual aid for this one. So there's a variety of studies that do dose responses and all-cause mortality. So all-cause mortality is sort of a measurement of general health and longevity. So it's basically a way of scientific studies telling us whether or not something is good or bad for us. And there's a variety of studies, including like these huge meta-analyses that look at how much level of intake of different foods or food groups has what effect on all-cause mortality. So there's certain foods that the more of them you eat, the better you are. So vegetables are like that. The more vegetables you eat, the healthier you'll be on average. So it's just almost a straight line. I eat more vegetables, I reduce my all-cause mortality. Interestingly, legumes are very similar. I eat more legumes, I reduce all-cause mortality. Then there's other foods that are the other way around. So the more of them I eat, the more I increase all-cause mortality. So we see this in sugar-sweetened beverages, for example, like soda. We see this in processed meats, for example. So the more processed meats, on average, the higher our all-cause mortality rates. And then there's foods that have non-linear relationships. So some of them will have, like nuts and seeds, for example, have a benefit up to, it's quite a steep little slope on this graph, up to about an ounce a day. And then it kind of levels off. There's no additional benefit above an ounce a day, but it's not necessarily causing, like it's not erasing the benefits that you were getting from that 0 to 1 ounce. Fruit has almost, it's kind of like a J-shaped curve. It's not quite U-shaped. So we see a really steep decline in all-cause mortality from 0 to 300 grams per day of fruit. So that is 2 to 3 servings, depending on the fruit per day. We see pretty impressive declines in all-cause mortality. And then it kind of levels out and it starts to creep back. So at about 600 grams daily, you've lost about half of the benefit. So it's approximately a 10 to 12% decrease in all-cause mortality at 300 grams and only like 5 to 6% decrease in all-cause mortality at 600 grams. But I think what's really important, especially when we're trying to make healthy changes sustainable, is to emphasize that 600 grams of fruit daily, so that's 5 or 6 servings of fruit, is still better than no fruit. Like 300 grams, like getting into that sweet spot, that would obviously be the best. So that 2 to 3 servings of fruit per day would be awesome. But high fruit consumption is still better than no fruit consumption. And I think that really helps us get over that fear of like fruit as nature's candy, which I think has done us a disservice to sort of label fruit as the same as refined sugars. And what's actually really interesting is because fruit has fiber and so many antioxidants, phytonutrients, vitamin C, there's been studies that have compared like high fructose corn syrup, like a lot of fructose from high fructose corn syrup versus the same amount, like 100 grams of fructose a day, which is very, very much above the toxicity levels for fructose, and compared that from whole fruit and shown that whole fruit is not as detrimental for the same amount of fructose as just drinking a glass of like corn syrup sweetened liquid, which is kind of what they do in these studies. So the metabolic impact is not as high. It still would be better to have moderate fructose intake below about 45 grams per day. But even getting up to 100 grams per day, if that fructose is coming from fruit, it is not as harmful as that fructose coming from a refined source. So, you know, we look at all of the science together, and I think fruit in moderation, and it really doesn't matter what fruit that is. So the fruit that you like is great. Fruit in moderation is actually incredibly beneficial. Fruit in excess is still not as harmful as avoiding fruit.
Good to know. I mean, when I was younger, a child, teenager, even a young adult, I honestly didn't eat any vegetables and it was all fruits. And now it's the opposite, where I am eating plenty of vegetables and a little bit of fruit. But it sounds like it's not a big deal if someone is eating like, not that you're encouraging them necessarily to eat like 4, 5, 6 servings per day, but it's not harmful to do that. And I guess the next question, if they are eating that many servings of fruit, should they up the ante when it comes to vegetables, or it really doesn't make a difference?
Yeah, I would, so, you know, certainly fruit can be, especially for bitter super tasters. So people who really just detect that very strong bitter flavor from especially cabbage family vegetables. But these people often don't like any vegetables, and it tastes different to them than it tastes to us, right? Like it tastes bitter and gross. And some people learn to love the bitter, but most people don't, and they tend to gravitate towards sweet treats. For someone like that, if fruit is your way into eating more fresh fruits and vegetables, I think that's an amazing trade. Like that's a great compromise. the conversation that I would want to have, I don't work with clients, but if I had clients, the conversation I would want to have would be, can we start trading some of that fruit for a little bit more vegetables? Or can we start, we're eating 5 or 6 servings of fruit per day and, 1 or 2 servings of vegetables. Can we even keep fruit where it is and just add a serving or 2 of vegetables? Like, can we ease into a little bit more vegetable? And maybe, there's some really fantastic recipes that actually combine fruit and vegetables. I mean, think about how fruit can really offset the bitter flavor of something like kale in a salad. So like looking at like, how can we combine this fruit with some vegetables to make those vegetables taste better? Because, we're talking about a person who loves their fruit. And I think that sort of gently encouraging a shift in balance, ideally we would have about 8 servings a day of fruits and vegetables. About 2 of those would be fruit and about 6 of those would be vegetables. It's kind of like the ideal ratio. Can we slowly shift that ratio? But I think it's also really important when we're trying to make dietary changes to make those like give and take compromises to keep things in a sustainable level. I think when we get into that, like, I have to use all my willpower to keep doing this thing, I hate what I'm eating, we're setting somebody up to like fall off the wagon again. And so being able to ease into a habit where we just eat more vegetables and that's really natural is a more sustainable approach than kind of like, okay, how am I going to force myself to eat more vegetables, if that makes sense?
Yep. No, that makes a lot of sense. And thank you for sharing that. So nutrient deficiencies, I wanted to talk a little bit with you about that. What are some of the more common nutrient deficiencies that you see? And then the follow-up, since a lot of if not everyone that or most people watching, listening to this have a thyroid or autoimmune thyroid condition, if there's any nutrients more common in those with hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism.
Oh yeah, that's a really good question. So studies that have just looked at it's typically NHANES data, so it's nutritional surveys of what Americans are eating, are actually, it's really surprising how common nutrient shortfalls are. So I'm going to use the word shortfall or insufficiency instead of deficiency. So studies show that about 1/3 of Americans are at risk for nutrient deficiency. Deficiency is when we're actually going to have a disease of malnutrition. So like scurvy from vitamin C deficiency, or rickets from vitamin D deficiency, or beriberi from vitamin B1 deficiency, or anemia from iron deficiency. So insufficiency is where we're not getting enough of those nutrients, but it's not so bad that we're going to have a disease of malnutrition. But what's really important to understand is that not getting enough nutrients, those nutrient shortfalls, increases our risk for every single chronic disease and infectious disease. And that's because our body uses nutrients. It's the raw materials of all the chemical reactions happening in our body all the time. And when you don't supply the raw materials that a cell needs to perform its function, it can't perform its function as well. And that strain builds up over time to impact that biological system in a negative way and increase risk for chronic disease. So nutrient insufficiencies are a big, big deal, but they're technically something a little bit different than a deficiency. Deficiency would be like, oh man, your gums are bleeding, you've got scurvy. Whereas insufficiency, you might not have any overt symptoms. You might feel fine, but your risk for some kind of chronic illness is increased over time. So the most common nutrient insufficiency is vitamin D. Basically 100% of us don't get enough vitamin D from our diet. But I don't know if we count that one as much because obviously we're making more vitamin D from sun exposure. But vitamin D, also, if you're deficient or insufficient, it's very, very hard to build your serum levels back up from diet and sunshine. So this is definitely a exception to the Nutrivore philosophy. Go get tested, figure out what your vitamin D is, talk to your healthcare provider, supplement accordingly, and retest to make sure you're supplementing enough and not overshooting the mark. So vitamin D will kind of put to the side, but I thought it's worth noting nobody gets enough vitamin D from their diet. Potassium is the next most common nutrient insufficiency. 97.8% of Americans don't get enough potassium in their diet, which is crazy. Not only that, but the USDA dietary guidelines, like the brand new ones, the 2020 to 2025 ones, they have a paragraph about like the nutrients that if you followed USDA dietary guidelines perfectly, here's the nutrients you wouldn't get enough of, and potassium's on that list, which I also think is a flaw in the USDA dietary guidelines. If they can list, 6 essential nutrients that you're not going to get enough of, even if you follow the guidelines perfectly, which only 7% of people even try to do. That's tangent. Vitamin E is next. 96.2% of people don't get enough vitamin E in their diets. Folate is next. 90.2% of people don't get enough folate in their diet. Then vitamin A, 80.1% of people don't get enough vitamin A in their diet. Vitamin K, 72.4% of people don't get enough vitamin K in their diet. 66.3% of people don't get enough magnesium in their diet. 56.3% of people don't get enough vitamin B1 in their diet. 54.9% of people don't get enough calcium in their diet. And 52% of people don't get enough vitamin C in their diet. So those are 10 nutrient deficiencies that over half of the population are not getting enough from their regular foods, which is, I think, just like the most shocking statistics is just to say, basically everyone is walking around with nutrient shortfalls, and that's increasing our risk for chronic disease. No wonder we've got so much chronic disease in Western countries.
Yeah. Have you done any research when it comes to thyroid health to see like if any of those nutrients are more deficient in people with hypothyroidism and or hyperthyroidism?
Yeah, so certainly there's research showing that, well, I guess there's 4 nutrients that are really important for thyroid health that people with hypothyroidism, especially, but also hyperthyroidism, are more likely to have these deficiencies, which are iodine, selenium, zinc, and iron. Iodine is really interesting because, of course, too low iron can cause thyroid shenanigans, and too much iodine. Too little iodine can cause hypothyroidism. Too much iodine can cause hypothyroidism. And selenium is really important for how our body, like the enzymes that are actually making thyroid hormone. So iodine is part of the structure of thyroid hormone. The enzymes that are making thyroid hormone are selenoenzymes. They're based on selenium. And then iron and zinc are really important cofactors. So those nutrients are the most important from a thyroid health perspective, or at least the nutrients where there's like pretty good science with people with hypothyroidism, where supplementing with those nutrients can improve thyroid hormone production.
So you mentioned iodine. So I wanted to ask you about sea vegetables because sea
Yeah.
vegetables are higher in iodine, and a lot of people are concerned about iodine. At least the people I work with. I mean, not everybody. There are some people that are fine, but some people do everything they can to avoid iodine. And I can't say I recommend to avoid like all food sources of iodine, but again, how about seaweed and kelp and other sea vegetables? Is it safe for people with Hashimoto's and Graves', for example, to consume sea vegetables, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, so I would definitely say, like, first of all, talk with your doctor. This is where a food journal where you're evaluating what iodine sources are in your diet already would be really important. You can do blood tests for iodine levels. But like looking at what your regular iodine intake is, most people are getting iodine from iodized table salt. That is the fortified food in Western countries that is supplying the most iodine. When you decide to switch to kosher salt or sea salt or Himalayan pink salt, you're now using a salt that has very little iodine. There actually is some, especially in Himalayan pink salt, that has such high mineral content, but it's nowhere near the same concentration as you're getting from iodized table salt. And so if you're eating a predominantly whole foods diet and you're using these unrefined salts, chances are actually really good that you're not getting enough iodine unless you happen to eat a lot of seafood. So we can get iodine from different foods, right? Eggs have a good amount of iodine. But the dominant food source of iodine is things that were in the ocean, and sea vegetables are some of our richest source of iodine. And really interestingly, studies show that about a serving or 2 servings per day of sea vegetables has some pretty big impacts on health, especially cardiovascular disease risk. And that may be because of not just iodine, but sea vegetables tend to have a lot of trace minerals. But they also have some really unique carotenoids like fucoxanthin, which we can't get in other foods that have some like really impressive health beneficial properties. But we do want to be careful about the iodine. So kelp especially is a very hot, like it just sequesters iodine. It's a very high iodine sea vegetable. Most of the other sea vegetables that you're going to get in the store have like a tenth the amount of iodine as kelp. So our daily value is 155 micrograms per day. The tolerable upper limit is 150. Okay, our daily value is 150 micrograms. The tolerable upper limit is 1100 micrograms. 1 to 2 servings of sea vegetables other than kelp will hit your iodine daily value, and you won't get close to that upper limit. You're going to be in a good range. With kelp, though, you would want to keep to 1 serving or less on a daily basis, and a serving is 5 grams dried. So it's not huge. It's basically like 1 nori sheet. But nori itself, I feel like that's like the most common sea vegetable that most people are eating. Nori is a lower iodine option. So with nori, you can have several sheets a day and you're not going to be anywhere close to that tolerable upper limit for iodine. So the one to really kind of just be aware of is kelp. And there's a lot of, right, like kombu is a type of kelp. So knowing your sea vegetables and which ones are kelp. But most ones like arami, wakame, nori are all low enough iodine that you can definitely have a serving or 2 every single day, get the benefits of sea vegetables and not have to worry about the iodine in it.
All right, wonderful. Thanks for sharing that. Selenium. So early I mentioned that Brazil nuts have the highest Nutrivore score with regards to nuts. And, you know, a lot of people know that, well, they don't know about the Nutrivore score until now, but they know that Brazil nuts are high in selenium. So a lot of people will eat Brazil nuts. So I guess the one question I had, which I don't know if you have the answer, but is selenium toxicity a concern if someone eats too many Brazil nuts, or since it's a food-based source, it's not a concern if someone was to eat like, you know, a cup of Brazil nuts, for example?
Yeah. So interestingly, there aren't. So acute toxicity for selenium, let's differentiate between acute toxicity and chronic toxicity. So acute toxicity is if you had a dose of something in one dose that was so much that it was a health problem. And for selenium, that's not actually very well defined. Chronic toxicity is. So that's where you have that same amount every single day for months. The chronic toxicity for selenium is around 900 micrograms. The tolerable upper limit is 400 micrograms, but there's a lot of studies showing intake in that in between 400 and 900 being totally fine. There's obviously some people who are more sensitive. That's why they set tolerable upper limits really like conservatively. And the daily value is 155 micrograms. So you can get the daily value of selenium from like 2 Brazil nuts, which is like phenomenal. They are such a rich source of selenium. That's what pushes their Nutrivore score up to 700, which is like way higher than just about any other nut or seed. It's because of its incredible selenium content. So you could pretty easily, like 10 to 12 Brazil nuts would hit that chronic toxicity level, but you would have to eat that many every single day for months in order for chronic selenium toxicity to show. So our bodies are pretty good for most nutrients of getting rid of excess. So sitting down and eating a cup one day is unlikely to be harmful. Not going to say guaranteed to not be harmful, because again, you know, different people are sort of differently sensitive. But like having a look through the literature, if I can, like the case studies I can find on selenium toxicity are all from supplements, not from Brazil nuts.
All right, very cool. Organ meat. So I know you encourage people to eat organ meat, and I don't know if off the top of your head, you know, like the Nutrivore scores with different types of organ meat, but I guess we could talk a little bit about organ meat. And a question I had is if someone absolutely does not want to eat organ meat, would having like organ meat capsules be a substitute?
Yeah. So organ meat, liver is the most nutrient dense organ meat, depending on which animal you're talking about. The Nutrivore scores range from about 2,500. That's sort of like chicken livers around 2,500, beef livers around 4,000, lamb livers around 6,000. So that's sort of the range. So they're incredibly nutritionally impressive foods. And then kidney is a little bit lower on average, and then heart's quite a bit lower on average. And interestingly enough, there's not too many other organs that I have a really complete data set on. So the most complete nutritional data I have is for these three that are the easiest for us to find generally. So if you look at the nutrients in liver, and you hate liver, but you know that it's a really nutritionally valuable food, I think the first thing to emphasize is that you can get a very similar nutrient profile from mollusks. So that is the group of shellfish that includes mussels, clams, and oysters, with about half the nutrient density. So you'd have to eat about twice as much mollusks per like serving of liver to get the same nutrients. So if you love clams and can afford them, and oysters, and can't stand liver, like that's one solution, is to swap it out for another food that is nutritionally similar. But organ meat capsules are like just a phenomenal option. Especially these, high quality freeze dried capsules, like I Love Smidge brand, for example. They are super convenient because you're not tasting anything, and it's just the liver, just freeze dried, which preserves the nutrients. That's the best way to encapsulate it. They're just gelatin capsules. And the thing that you need to know, though, is your fresh equivalent. So typically the dose on the bottle is like, depending on the brand you're looking at, is 4 to 6 capsules. And that typically translates to, if you have that every single day, about 2 ounces of liver over the course of the full week. So if you follow what's on the bottle, you're getting half a serving of liver over 7 days. So that's just something to know. If that's your only source of liver, it's better to get a full serving a week. So you just might want to, again, talk to your doctor, because I can't recommend any supplements, but talk to your doctor about doubling the number of capsules.
All right, that's good to know. So fatty acid deficiencies, can you quickly talk about like how common are they, especially if people don't eat fish? Because I know you advocate eating seafood on a regular basis, especially and including fish. So if someone, again, just isn't a seafood lover, there's fish oils and all that, but not exactly the same. So I'll let you take over.
So true fatty acid deficiency is very rare. But what we see is that the balance of omega-3 fats and omega-6 fats that we consume is very important. So it's not so much about exactly how much we get, but that we don't want to have way too many omega-6 and not enough omega-3s. And unfortunately, most plant foods, most of the foods in the modern food supply, have quite a lot of omega-6s. Where we're getting omega-3s are mainly from seafood. We get the long chain omega-3s are from seafood and sea vegetables, algae, for example. We can get short chain omega-3s from plant foods, especially things like chia seeds, walnuts, sacha inchi seeds are very high. And we do convert some of that into longer chain omega-3 fats in our body, but we really need to kind of think of them. They do different things. They're both really good for us, but they kind of do different things physiologically. So those long chain omega-3 fats, the more of them we eat, they reduce risk of mental health conditions, of neurodegenerative disease. They're really, really important for preventing cardiovascular disease, and they're really, really important for immune health and for gut health in general. And so it's sort of not about how much we're eating, but that balance. And we can typically, not worry about how much omega-6s we're getting, as long as our diet isn't like super high fat and super high, vegetable oil. As long as we're getting sort of 3 to 4 servings of a oily fish per week, that's typically the amount that we would need to eat to balance omega-6s in our diet. And so for someone who is allergic to fish or shellfish, there are algae oil supplements that can provide those long chain omega-3s. So that's a good, or a vegan option for if anyone was, looking for a vegan way to get those long chain omega-3s. But the most affordable option is to just eat fish, and canned fish is a fantastic way to go. It's very affordable. I feel like canned foods have been super maligned. And one of the big insights that I've had, doing all of these calculations for the Nutrivore score is that canned foods they've got a really, they didn't earn this bad rap. They are nutritionally extremely similar to the fresh raw food. And there's even examples of canned foods that are more nutrient dense than the fresh raw version, including Eastern oysters are more nutrient dense canned than fresh. Don't ask me why, because I don't fully understand why. That's just the way the math works out. But yeah, so one of the best things we can do to, again, sort of prevent problems with immune health, cardiovascular health, gut health, and brain health is to make sure that we are consuming enough of those, again, sort of fatty fish are where we're getting the most omega-3 fats.
All right. Well, I know we're running out of time, but I wanted to ask you one more question and the question as far as like some of your favorite non-dairy sources of calcium, just because I do recommend, especially when people follow an autoimmune protocol, they're going to be avoiding dairy. And a lot of people will be like, well, if I can't have dairy, where am I getting my calcium? So where can people get calcium if they're not eating dairy?
So on the autoimmune protocol specifically, okay, I'll back up. Nuts and seeds are a great source of calcium. That's obviously not AIP friendly. So on the AIP, green vegetables, typically, especially dark green leafy vegetables, are typically very good sources of calcium that's highly bioavailable. Mushrooms have a good amount of calcium. Oranges have a good amount of calcium. One of my favorite sources, though, is blackstrap molasses. So a tablespoon of blackstrap molasses only has 42 calories. So it's not a high sugar sweetener, but it has more calcium per calorie than cheese and more iron per calorie than steak. It actually has 20% of the daily value of both calcium and iron. It's got some other minerals. It's got lots of B vitamins. It's actually it has a Nutrivore score of like 340, which is quite impressive. It's in a completely, it's in its own ballpark. It doesn't even share a share space with other sugars in terms of nutrient density. And so that's like a great option. Yes, a permission to eat something sweet, I think, is always appreciated on the AIP. And then another great option for AIPers is mineral drops for water. So typically, natural water sources have a lot of dissolved mineral content. Tap water and most bottled water does not. And so one of the easiest ways to increase mineral content, if you're not going to go for like a spring water, like Grolsteiner spring water has a huge amount of calcium. That would be like my go-to recommendation. Plus it's delicious. But mineral drops, there's lots of different options out there. Just look at the label. And there's lots of unflavored options. So it's just the minerals for adding to water is another kind of great way to up calcium intake on the AIP without having to like reach for a calcium supplement, because calcium supplements are associated with like higher risk of kidney stones and potentially increased risk of cancer over the long term in the scientific literature. So obviously, again, there's always a time and a place for supplements. Talk to your doctor. If your doctor recommends it, like that's a completely different situation. But calcium supplements, as a general rule, we really only want to take if those are our only options.
And then you mentioned also fish. So like fish, like sardines with the bones and other fish as well.
How could I forget canned fish with the bones is like as much calcium as a glass of milk. So sardines, canned salmon, like if you're eating the bones, that is, yes. Not only are you getting the calcium, you're getting all of the minerals that our bones need. And the other thing that's really important about calcium is that vitamin K and vitamin D are really important for calcium metabolism. So vitamin D affects how much calcium we're absorbing. So you really don't want to be vitamin D deficient, because then you can't even absorb the calcium from your food. And vitamin K is really important for shuttling calcium around to the right spot in our body. So we want to make sure that we're getting enough of those as well. And it just so happens that seafood is another great source of vitamin D. And those leafy vegetables that also have calcium are a great source of vitamin K. So salmon and kale, I think, was the top recommendation there.
All right. Well, Dr. Sarah, where can people learn more about Nutrivore? And feel free to share any other resources you'd like to.
Yeah, like come on over to the new site, Nutrivore.com. We launched with like 250 articles. We're adding several articles every single week. We're like continuing to build out the site, but there's so much there to explore. You can search the entire Nutrivore Score database of 8,000 foods. You can see detailed nutritional information on a whole mess load of foods. You can learn about different nutrients. There's detailed articles on what nutrients do in the body. Those detailed articles have links to the foods that are top sources. So if you are really interested in just food sources of calcium, you can go to the calcium article and then click into the foods that are great sources of calcium. And we're continuing to build out this resource. I mean, I think we will be for years. I have plans. I have so many plans. And then from there, like, make sure that you go up to the top menu and click join. That's where you can find links to my social media. I'm at Dr. Sarah Ballantyne, just about anywhere online that you can think of. That's where you can find links to join my newsletter. And I've got 5 free Nutrivore guides that I would love to send to your inbox. So I've got some awesome resources to share with you. That's where you can link to things like my Patreon and just my community in general. So definitely make sure to check the join in the menu at the top.
All right. And I'll, of course, make sure to include all those links in the show notes. And thank you so much, Dr. Sarah, for sharing your knowledge about nutrient density and Nutrivore. And I'm sure a lot of people will be visiting your Nutrivore website, as well as your YouTube channel and other social media platforms. And yeah, just again, can't say enough good things about what I've seen so far. And just, yeah, I'm also excited about what's to come in the future. And again, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thanks again for having me. I really enjoyed this.